a kind of explanation of the things that somebody coming to Kabuki for the first time might wonder about. Something that they wouldn't be used to. So they attempt to give explanations of these. Whoops, sorry. Then we get a variety of moving stories, and they focus on a few plays and tell about it with catchy titles like Chushingura is a tale of samurai honor, and Kurowa Bunsho is a heartwarming tale of young love set in the glamorous pleasure quarters of old Osaka. So we get a lot of, kind of enticing, pulling us in information. Then we get tips for your first visit. English, if you don't speak Japanese, obviously here. One of the ones that I'm going to highlight right now is the one called Shouts from the Audience. The audience may respond to the actors. Okay, this is really not true. And they go on to explain, you might be startled by shouts from the audience seats during the performance. Kabuki is a popular entertainment. The actors and audience become very close. But this is really became very close, which isn't to say that there aren't still people who are huge fans and follow actors. There certainly are. But the kind of situation being described here is an Edo period phenomenon into Meiji, but really not today. To prove it, some audience members shout out during the plays or dances as applause and encouragement to the actors. This traditional practice called kakegoe adds a lot to the atmosphere. It stimulates both the actors and the rest of the spectators and can make for a thrilling experience. Well, in fact, no, we're not free to do that. We wouldn't know how to do it. It's professionals who are hired by the theaters who do that now to simulate some kind of atmosphere. On the other hand, they don't want the foreigners and Japanese who haven't really ever experienced Kabuki to get too excited and carried away. So it's very carefully, it's part of the show, actually, at this point. It was part of the show in the past, you could say, but that's a different show. That's the show of audience and performers interacting, and this is more part of the staged show at this point. Then they have a section called Eye of the Beholder. We get History of Kabuki. We have an interesting section called Presentation, not Representation. I'll come back to that in a minute. No Director is an important one about the fact that actors know their repertoire well, they don't need long rehearsals, etc. Much of this is still, of course, true. And then in the section called Keeping Tradition and Creating the New, they talk a lot about serious scholarly efforts to revive plays from Kabuki's earlier years. They talk about Tojuro, the forced Chikamatsu revivals, and Kanzaburo's Nakamura-za, and some of these modern things. In the presentation, not representation, it draws on a kind of old discussion in theater studies of presentational theater forms versus representational theater forms, which really comes out of sort of 19th century ideas of European and American realism. It really has a lot to say, but it unfortunately, in my opinion, it doesn't work very well for Kabuki, because Kabuki has its own kind of realism, as most theaters do. There's certain kinds of plays we can watch that are extremely realistic. Otherwise, why do we weep in the middle, or at the end of the performance when things happen? They affect us in a very real way. But this one is interesting. It talks about a fundamental principle of Kabuki performances as presentational, implying that all stage action is consciously directed outwards towards the audience. Things are clearly displayed in a formal manner rather than a realistic way. So I could argue about this, and there's some truth to some of what's here. But the point is, this is really for an audience that is used to Western theater. It's coming from that point of view. People who are sort of used to some of the arguments about it one way or another. I won't go into more detail because I don't think I will have time. And here's the one about the director, the main actor directs the play, and it goes into some detail about that. Finally, it ends with a recommendation from celebrities. And so they take one of the most wanted opera directors, and he talks about his admiration for Kabuki. So just to give an extra plug. Okay, so moving along, here's the Kabuki-za that many of us remember before it was recently revived in slightly many different ways. But the reason I put this here is to show that the relationship between the audience and what goes on stage. Here are, when we go to the theater, when we go to Kabuki today, we sit in a Western style theater with seats, each person sitting in their own chair, sections of the theater. And as I said before, we don't call out anymore. We're not boisterous. We're quiet. We respect the performance. We clap at the end. How was that in the Edo period? Well, this is from an Edo period book called Kyakusha Hyobanki by Shikisei Samba, who some of you may know, was a very important fiction writer who was also obsessed with Kabuki in the Edo period. And here we see, you know, this not only are the seats sort of so filled that a fire marshal would never approve it today, but we see all different kinds of things. The longer you look at this, you see a little boy who's reading probably what's called an Eiri Kyogen bon, which means it's an illustrated version of what's on there. There's people crying, there's people very affected, but just to get a feeling that the audience is sort of, they're all over each other and they're all hanging over, and it's not a pretty kind of neat scene, it's a very vibrant, lively scene. And then this picture that I first showed you, these are the people in the sort of fancier seating areas, and then you've got these people who are sitting in the so-called masu, the boxed off areas down below, which are cheaper seats. And they crammed, I mean, it depends on the period, 7 to 9 people into these. I forget the measurement, but it doesn't really matter. You can see here, if it's full, it's pretty crowded. But the actors are right there on you. They're right with you. There's no sort of separation. Kabuki's famous for the hanamichi, so that the actors are walking through the audience. But here, the actors are really connected to the audience. And, whoops. I just put in these couple of pictures to show you how people felt about Kabuki at the time. This is somebody who's called a theater lover, or maybe lover isn't quite the word, but a super fan maybe, or something like that. And he is surrounded. He's got probably an illustrated bansuke that shows him the actors, the thing on the floor there in front of him, and he's got a number of other things, and he's carefully looking over all of his stuff. People bought lots of things related to Kabuki, illustrated and otherwise. And here are a couple of men who are poring over one of these illustrated books that the little boy was looking at. So these were often used at home. You could buy them in the theater district. So these are the people who are involved with Kabuki at the time. Today is a little bit different. Well, I guess what I'm trying to show here is that for those who were fans of Kabuki, it was kind of it was a huge part of your life, both going to the theater and keeping up with it at home in one way or another. Fan activities for particular actors, or these kinds of activities. So moving along, some of the books that were, so you have all of these publications that are created for fans and for interested people to be able to buy. And it's like buying a fan magazine or a biography of your favorite movie star, or, I don't know, Vogue magazine when some favorite actress, nobody's coming to mind at the moment, is done a photo shoot for them. I mean, it's a lot of those kinds of materials for keeping up. But then there were also sort of a beginning, there was a big boom from the middle of the 18th century, like the date here, of all sorts of printed, I guess we could say encyclopedia type material, also actor memoirs, a number of different things that we can use to learn a lot about Kabuki. A word that's used to cover these is the word gekisho, so theater books. This is a modern term, actually. And I'll just read a minute here. They can be defined as written works during the Tokugawa period about any aspect of Kabuki. The term is a recent one. I think in the Edo period they were often called gekijōshō, if they were referred to theater books. But this new term gekisho is coined for convenience by scholars, and it covers a wide range of materials. Akuma Ryo's work was paramount in gaining an understanding of the vast array of these materials. A broad definition includes around 500 items. With a more restricted definition, it takes us to about 200. This leaves out certain kinds of critique booklets and a few other things. The starting point that's most useful for categorizing them is by intended recipients, which is to say they were created either for the sole use two kinds of people who were in the theater practitioners, so for the use of theater insiders, or like some of the things we saw in the pictures a minute ago, for publication and purchase. So individual examples of the Nera group, they're often categorized as zuihitsu when they get categorized at all, and they aim at analysis of various aspects of Kabuki. They can be broadly divided between newly written works and revised pre-existing works. So some things were so interesting they would get republished with some updates. There were the secret ones that were passed around mostly in manuscript form and only among professionals, and those published for public consumption. Some were written for the public consumption, some were written to encourage the interest of spectators, like guidebooks for the audience, as opposed to the manuals for theater practitioners. Some were secret manuals in the tradition of Zeami's treatises. They were for the instruction of professionals by professionals, and often had a guarded readership as protection from outside competition. An example is a work called Saksha Ninju Gyoji, Annual Duties of Playwrights, which is written in 1848, so quite a bit later than the one I'm about to show you. And it details the Edo playwrights' duties month by month. It was never published, but it was copied and read and borrowed within the theater. And the author tells us that it was written for the sole use of contemporary playwrights. Another secret example is a work called Sekai Komoku, like a kind of handbook of the stories that form the basis of Kabuki plays. It's an explanatory list of story and character material available to playwrights in commencing play creation. So we don't have information regarding the original compiler of this work, but its significance comes from the constant use made of it by generations of playwrights who kept it continually useful by revising and updating its information. So I'm not really talking about these works today, because these, as I say, we can call them secret treatises. They're works that help professionals in their duties. And they aren't meant to be disseminated to the outside, because that gives away certain secrets of the theater, and for other reasons as well. So what we're looking at are the ones that were available for purchase and were written with the idea that there was a big purchasing public out there. So two that I'll highlight right now is this first one, Kokon Yakusha Taizen from 1750, and then a second one called Kabuki Jishi from 1762. So both right around the middle of the 18th century. The first one, Kokon Yakusha Taizen, is divided into 6 maki. The first one, and this is just, I'll say it out because this is very typical of these kinds of encyclopedia type works. The first we'll call chapter. The first chapter is the origins and history of Kabuki, talks about actors, different types of roles, musicians, the production calendar, sort of all sorts of general information. The second to fourth chapters are kind of actor by actor critique, the history of each actor, the traditions of the actor's line, a little bit of critique of their style, but not connected to any particular production, but in general, what they're good at, what they're not good at. The fifth chapter is anecdotes about actors, and what's interesting here is it actually quotes other treatises that were publicly available. So it goes to some of these works that I'm talking about and quotes them for backup of what they're trying to say. So if this is 1750, we already have plenty of works around that can be quoted for backup. And finally, the last one draws very complicated diagrams of lineages among actors. Now these are illustrated, and I just put in a couple illustrations. This one is in front of the theater. People are walking. The writing up at the top talks about this. It tells us that people are walking in front, that you can see the entrances for both of those raised seats. Some are on the Higashi side and some are on the Nishi side, so you can see the two entrance ways. It says young people are wearing chic clothing. Furyu is the word that they use. And hawkers are doing what's called kawairo, which is where famous actors who are now appearing on the stage, they'll mimic their voice and and some of the speeches that they're going to give to entice you to come in. It talks about the money that they're taking in, and it also tells that this lively scene we see here is like this every day. The show is just that popular. Now, here's inside the theater. That was outside the theater, here's inside, and the writing tells us about, mostly focuses on the seating arrangements, actually. And it compares the Kansai area, Kamigata and Edo, for seating, the differences in the theaters. There's a lot of comparing of Edo and Kamigata, which of course today in anything written about Kabuki you'll see so little of. It's all been kind of a little more homogenized as far as traditions go. All right, then a second work is this one I said, Kabuki Jishi. Sometimes you see it as written as Kabuki Koto Hajime, but actually the Jishi, we don't have to get into which it should be, but I'll say Jishi for any people here who disagree. I'm sorry. 1762. This one, again, I'll just quickly say the chapters, it's 5 chapters instead of 6, but first one is history, the second one is more about actors and the Kabuki production calendar. The third one is interesting, it has a lot about dance and the accompanying songs for dance. And the fourth one is actors of the past, about their acting and dancing, what their skills are. And then the fifth one talks a lot about the people who help produce Kabuki and perform in non-acting roles. It talks about writers, other kinds of play-making people behind the scenes, musicians, shamisen players. So it's very valuable for some of that information. Okay, here's a couple images from it. Again, these were all illustrated. I'm all using woodblock technique, but not in color, just in using black ink. So this one is in this section, as you might imagine. If you look at this and you looked at pictures of Kabuki before, you can see it's a very early stage of Kabuki. It's still pretty much the no stage. It's got the roof. It's got even the 3 pimes. And so this is in the history section, no surprise there. And it's actually talking about the opening production of the calendar year in which, in Kyoto, in which the Shiki Sambaso was always performed, and it talks about a change in custom, and that the sort of main actor, manager, in the old days didn't perform the role of Okina. If he didn't perform it, then it wasn't performed. But today that custom is lost. And so it says in Edo, this main actor always performs it on New Year's morning. In other words, it wasn't always performed before. It was up to that actor whether to do it or not. So this is the history section. That's information that isn't in the text. I'm just showing you illustrations right now. Then there are pages like this which show actors, and each one is just labeled. Why would you want this? Well, maybe you want to get used to what the actor's likeness is, because when you go to buy prints of actors that you adore in the current productions, there's certain iconographic ways of showing actors. Maybe they have a very prominent feature, and that's going to be brought out. So this is a way to kind of study who the actors are, but also, how they tend to be shown in print. There's a couple famous ones here on the top right is Iwai Hanshiro. This is a very interesting acting line because the fourth Iwai Hanshiro became an onnagata. It was one of the most famous onnagata female impersonator actors in the Edo period. But the ones before him did male roles. And this actor, it's a little hard to fully decide who everyone is because this is produced in 1762. But this must be the third Iwai Hanshiro, who got so corpulent toward the end of his life that the last 4 or 5 years he couldn't even act anymore. It said that he was very fond of food. So this is certainly before he got to that point. And in the bottom row, third from the left is Ichikawa Ebizo, whom, excuse me, this would be Danjuro II. who held the name, excuse me, he took the Danjuro name when his father died, but then later he took the Ebizo name, so this is him. So there's some very famous actors and some others. Okay, and finally I just put this one in. Oh, shoot. That didn't go too well. Let's see. I'm not used to this kind of computer, but I can manage. Okay, here. Is this one? I'm glad it's not just me. Thank you.
For the color side.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. All sorts of, this is why I was saying all sorts of details. There's a few different pages of this, hairstyles. And then each one is labeled what it is. There might be a little note, there might not. Okay, so these Edo period works are they go into so much different kind of detail. They show you everything from exactly what the costumes are and the different, look how many hairstyles that had, and there's another page of it. So this is clearly for people who really want to know all kinds of details about what they're seeing on stage and appreciating it. Of course, knowing these hairstyles tells you a lot about the character and what kind of character it is, and also about the actor and the choices made for how to depict the character through costume and through how you look. So these kinds of encyclopedic sort of works that I'm talking about often have this very detailed kind of work. At the same time, the histories are there. Lots of talk about the actors, and these are actors you know because you go to see them all the time. And you know their father and what their father was like, and you're watching the little son come up the ranks. So, it's a very intimate kind of connection. Now moving back to today. So a couple things happen, of course, in the Meiji period. One is the effort to gain an international audience. And Kabuki gets explained in foreign languages. And a number of studies start cropping up for that purpose. Studies based around play translations. More recent examples are some books that probably a lot of you have seen or are aware of. So these will have introductions to the plays, usually a general introduction as well. Like traditional Japanese theater starts off with a general introduction that gives historical perspectives. So that's kind of an echo of the past. You start with the history. And then it gives what Karen Brazell called general characteristics of all the traditional theater forms. One example, flexibility of time and space. Centrality of form is another. So she tries to pull the different pre-modern forms together. And she looks at stages and all of that. The Kabuki plays on stage in the introduction does a similar thing. It gives a history. Talks about the different genres of plays, like meaning jidai mono, seiwa mono, shosagoto. It talks about various characteristics of Kabuki and certain cultural aspects. And it then divides everything into 4 historical periods. So we don't have to go into that kind of detail right now. But that was one way to start getting people interested. Another was later come scholarly studies that aren't formed around translations, and some examples there of authors who did some really important work. And then just right now, a new such work has come out, The Cambridge History of Japanese Theater. Julie Etzi, sitting right over there, wrote the Kabuki section, a really marvelous job. And that's interesting because, she calls it Kabuki Superheroes and Femme Fatale, so focus on the kinds of characters. And I think this is interesting because what I'll try to show you is that what happens with a lot of these explaining Kabuki materials in the modern period is a shift to focus on the plays and the kinds of characters, a shift away from talking about actors. You notice that the books I talked about, huge part of them is about actors, talking about where they fit in their line and how they act and what are their specialties. and particular critiques. But these books tend to all focus around plays, as you can see. And in the Kabuki section of the Cambridge history, there's a kind of more on Kabuki. They do something in this book they call spotlights, and then they have a focus page sometimes as well. And this is where they pick up certain things that weren't fully, need more amplification, or for whatever reasons they wanted to bring out. And so there's one on the stage, one on onnagata, one on modern stars, actor prints, aragoto acting, regional kabuki, etc. So this is another approach. Finally, gaining an international audiences, internet studies and resources. Some of us in here are involved in something called GLOPAC. Bing Chu has been involved from the start. Came out of Cornell, which is it's actually international theater, but it has its most developed part is about Japanese theater. So this has become a way to present. But those of us who work on that, it's always the biggest question is what are we presenting and why and how and to whom? And so, by the time you figure all that out, the technology has moved way ahead and it's already obsolete. So it's pretty much a tricky business. I guess speaking about today, since my title had yesterday and today, there were great changes in the Meiji period. Scholarly studies came out under the gaze of Western viewers and scholars, and I mean both of those. In other words, there was great consciousness about who would be watching Kabuki and what would they think about it and what do we want to do about that, as well as scholarship, because Western forms of scholarship started becoming important as certain Japanese went to study abroad and brought home new methods. So new kinds of scholarly studies and changes in theater criticism were very important. And this is another spot where I'd like to just read a little. First, I just want to say that these Meiji changes are such that many people didn't have as much opportunity to go to Kabuki, although it remained very vibrant down to today in various ways. It's had its ups and downs, but audience and knowledge of audience has changed a lot over this period. Tanizaki wrote a memoir in which he talks about his Kabuki viewing in the Meiji period. It's very charming, actually. And he talks about how he went as a little boy. His uncle loved Kabuki, his mother did, so they would take him until they didn't quite have enough money to do it anymore. And he said he doesn't, he was writing, I think, in the 30s or something when he wrote this, but just saying that, that kind of early exposure isn't going to happen anymore. And of course, that makes a huge difference for what your audience is. One of the things that's important and kind of a mirror on all this in talking about the changes is looking at theater criticism as a mirror of these kinds of changes. And so let me say a little about Kabuki criticism as a way to understand some of the changes. From the Edo period are the yakusha hyobanki. These were the critique booklets that were connected to particular productions. They are critique booklets of the actors. And then in the Meiji period, new kinds of publications arose that were devoted to Kabuki criticism in the context of the great reforms envisioned for Kabuki from the mid-Meiji period. The yakusha hyobanki of the Edo period had a strong connection to the maintenance of Kabuki's significance in the cultural calendar year and to the formation of the very active relationships between actors and audiences. And they had an independent existence as competitive commercial products in a highly commercial era. So in other words, selling these actor critique booklets was business. They attained a fixed form by the end of the 17th century and were published annually for the next 200 years. It's really a very remarkable publishing fact. With separate volumes for each of the three major urban centers of the period, Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto. A piece of fiction is there, and then come the critiques of each actor who had appeared in the performance that had just occurred or was still on the boards. The rank of each actor is appended, and below the rank is the actor's crest, by which he is identified in woodblock prints on costumes and on a variety of other items, including products sold under his name. This section is illustrated, and I just want to, I'm being forced to finish up pretty quickly, so give me just a few minutes. What I want to talk about is that a lot of words change during this period. We no longer talk about shibai, we talk about engeki. We don't talk about kyogen, we talk about gikyoku. A lot of the vocabulary I'm talking about theater as a result of this interaction. But periodicals dedicated to kabuki arise, and the articles are mostly written by literary men, who are the people who are kind of leading the crusade for so-called reform in various aspects of cultural scene in the Meiji period. So we now have, instead of sort of paid writers to do the critiques, we now have literary men who are taking this on as a kind of cause to write. And we also have a kind of effort toward a more, let's say, subjective, objective approach. There's newspaper criticism, magazines that attempt to kind of stand back and look at the object of study. It's a less intimate, less connected one. I'm going to skip through a bunch of this since I have to finish. But the audiences, Meiji criticism was part of an arrangement where the early critics wrote in such a way that audiences learned to consider plays as separate entities from their performance by actors. And this is a kind of critical point. The audience became increasingly passive in their engagement during performance, and they learned to sit still and appreciate. Active engagement left only relics, the cries of praise or rebuke, the home kotoba, which had livened Edo period theaters and represented the mutuality of the actor-audience relationship, became staged, as we just talked about when we looked at the Shochiku Kabuki site. Okay, I'm going to show a few more slides. Can I have 5? We can skip the Q&A, and then you can just ask me later. I just want to show these few things. Okay, so first of all, I just wanted to say a little bit about gaining a modern Japanese audience. Again, scholarship started changing, and there were a number of very scholarly works. These are the ones that are meant to, however, these ones are meant to reach out to Japanese who maybe don't really know anything about kabuki, and they're curious to go. So we have Kabuki Saijiki. Hattori Yukio is one of the more renowned kabuki scholars, but he's written these other works that aim a little more, not at his colleagues, but at everyone else who might want to go. And in the Kabuki Saijiki, he sort of attaches some seasonal aspect to a play every time and talks about a play through a seasonal aspect. And then in the next one is particular vocabulary connected to kabuki. And then we have one that talks about the different occupations of kabuki, which is interesting, but it has this thing about kangeki ga motto tanashiku naru. And so, it's it's this appeal to let's all, go have fun at the kabuki theater. So a lot of, what I want to show you next are just a couple examples, a lot of general primers of a sort that are very rudimentary explanatory works that wouldn't have really been necessary in the same way in the Edo period. So you have, skip that. So here's one, for example. And this one is, you open it up, it's got a number of, it sort of explains kabuki first, like this, very basic stuff, Edo to Kamigata, a number of different, just very general stuff about kabuki. And then it has some essays, and then each play, this is for Shibaraku, but each play gets 2 pages. It gets a page that explains, and then it gets a picture. And then we have a bunch of books like this, which are famous speeches excerpted. Now, you did have this in the Edo period. There were some books that you could buy to imitate actors doing speeches. This is carried over. So this is a book that has, this is just, I think there's about 40 plays, and each one is represented with a famous either dialogue or speech, and then explaining words we might not know anymore because we don't live in the Edo period, and then a kind of kaisetsu about it. And this is a second one of those. And this one has illustrations. The other one didn't. So of course it has Tamasaburo on the cover. And then it sort of takes a couple plays, and then it gives you more detail, more illustration. So it's kind of a pattern. That's the last slide. It's kind of a pattern to do that. So, you know, you have these kinds of books which are focused around the plays. So you notice it was the famous speeches, which, as I said, those exerted speeches did exist in the Edo period. But these books that are most popular, where you explain a whole play, you take 40, the second book has about 60 plays. This kind of phenomenon you don't see so much in the Edo period. And it is this focus around the plays rather than the actors. It's a big change as we move into this period. The change, as I have said, comes from this different kind of audience. We now have moved from, you know, intimate fans to novices, really more. From people who want really kind of digging down deep with lots of details, more anecdotes about actors, more details about the real fine points of production, to people who, you know, don't know what kakegoi is, so you have to explain that, or don't know, you know, basic history of Kabuki or whatever it might be. These works are more rudimentary, and they assume nothing in the way of engagement. The kind of detailed discussions that I showed in the Edo period works, where you're comparing, you know, Edo and Kamigata practices and various details, were meant to increase knowledge of something that one already knew quite a bit about, and to add some trivia, which is always fun when you're really engaged in something that you love to get trivia and all sorts of little actual details. So as this sort of scholar, you know, the scholarly scholarship in the 20th century and now has advanced tremendously in the sense of moving in a more academic direction, but general knowledge has lessened. And so I leave you with that, and just to repeat that it's some of the issues that face us when we're trying to talk about traditional theater forms is how you actually present them, because what we can assume people's knowledge is from a variety of angles, whether that's about the form you're talking about, Kabuki or no, or something like that, or just about how theater is conceived in general, is much less clear. And you spend, as I say, a lot of time thinking about that. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I think we're going to still take some questions, whether she wants to answer them or not. But let's try and go about 5 minutes or so. Does anyone have any? Yes, John.
I just wonder, you know, there was no internet or TV in the Edo period, and so to put all of that, the gossip and the promotion of performers at that time, you needed to make these books. But today, certainly, Shochiku does a great job of making sure that there's scandal on television and in magazines. And so do you think that that's maybe taking the place of those former?
You know, the scandals then were in the plays. So the plays were often, you know, about current scandals. And there were other forms of production that focused on scandals too. So I'm not sure if I'm exactly getting what you're asking, but I don't think, I mean, I think there were all sorts of ways. People seem to always love scandals. That doesn't change period to period.
We were saying that they were focusing mostly on actors in the publications back then, whereas now we're focusing on the plays, but we're still getting the ideas of the actors, but through mass media.
I see what you're saying. Okay, so yes, but I'm only focusing on these books that are explaining kind of more broadly about Kabuki. But there were many other ways you could get information about favorite actors. I mean, the woodblock prints is one thing. Mostly those are connected to productions. But there were also other kinds of sort of gossip sheets and other, you know, it worked its way into a variety of areas. So some very comparable things to the way it's done today, and just different, you know, technology. So, but it is true that a lot of the way to think about sort of the scandalous things and the gossipy things form the plots of plays too. So that was, it wasn't just that you picked up the newspaper in the morning and you read something that someone did, or you bought People magazine and you read it, but it also was worked out on stage too.
Thank you. Actually, my question is somehow related to this question. So I want to ask about the role of the production side. I mean that the shochiku should be have a huge role in terms of the getting popularity, how to get the new audience in terms of the highs and lows of Kabuki. So I want to ask you about the role of the production side.
Today, the shochiku.
Today, yeah.
Well, I showed the website not because I think my main reason was to show that some of the issues in there go back far, but that also they're trying to reach people who would have no knowledge. So that's a major way that they do it. And as you said, they also feed a lot of information about star actors. Kabuki's always been a celebrity theater, and so there's sort of, that's a tried and true sort of thing that just continues, with new forms of dissemination. So I think they're working very hard on that. The new theater, whatever you might think of it, that's sort of another attempt, to create a kind of atmosphere when you get off at the subway station, and then you're supposed to feel like a lively kind of town or something, theater area, district. So they're obviously thinking a lot about that, how to make it popular again. And there was a period when I was first going to see Kabuki that it was so easy to buy a ticket. You never thought about it for 10 minutes before you could think, oh, I want to go see that. And then there was a period where you couldn't buy them at all because it was so popular. So it has its ups and downs. But I think, once it kind of got more popular again, it's remained. And so they've done a lot that is working well. And I think the website is one way to go about doing it.
I think Michael has a question. I just wanted to say that some of the students who came in too, if you have a question after this, we'll let Michael talk, but please feel free to ask. We don't want to include you. Michael, we'll let you go first though.
Yeah, prepare them.
A quick question out of sheer ignorance. Who decides the monthly programs? At what stage? Obviously it's decided a long time in advance, but they perform, right, most of the month and then, the next month. And they're a couple months ahead. So is it shochiku? Is it a committee? Is it actors, the main actors say, oh, it's my turn, I'm going to perform in December and I'd like to do this?
I think Julie was...
Well, the shochiku pretty much is the one that's making those decisions. And even the National Theater, they have to wait to see what the shochiku decides they're going to be doing, what actors they need, and then the National Theater.
It's an economic decision in large part. So certain plays you can see are performed very frequently, and then they try to slip in a few here and there that are performed less frequently. But of course it has to do with the actors too. But yeah, so this is a big difference obviously from the Edo period. First of all, the managers were the top actors. They weren't the only ones who decided, but more or less, and it had all to do with what the actors were ready to do. So,
Any students here, or feel free to, any questions? No? Okay, Laura, you're young.
No, I'm not. My question's about audiences, about to what extent does the production company want to sort of cultivate audiences who already know? So is there a different website for them, or is it all about sort of evangelism to people who know nothing so far?
Yeah, it's a really good question. There are, as I said, there's really a lot of Kabuki scholars now. So for people who know a lot, they tend to go to those kinds of work. So some of the ones that I showed here, like the one on that's divided according to occupation in the theater, that would be of great interest, I think, to the kind of person you're describing, because it's just a little more kuashi than the other ones.
Yeah, I think I mean fans fans of, not necessarily fans of the academic side of things, but the people who've seen all the plays and now actually do know, even now, what, you know, the differences between a particular production and another one, or
So is there a website for that? I mean, there yes.
it's like kind of a non-academic fans website.
You mean blogs, Twitter? You mean things like that?
I guess I do.
In the know world, the blogs are fascinating, and Twitter is used widely by actors and stuff.
There's a little less of that, actually.
Aren't there a number of fan groups?
But that's what I was going to say. There are fan groups, and so this is also a carryover from the Edo period, where you have a group that supports a particular actor. And those groups still exist. They're not quite, it's a slightly different relationship. But then, you know, they will have access to their actor. But I think you're asking more about written materials or websites and that kind of thing. I mean,
Well, and also sort of an audience with whom the performers feel more comfortable as well, with whom they don't have to assume no knowledge whenever they do anything.
I'm not sure you
Is it
ever
something-
have that audience, but you might, I mean, you'll have some members in the audience like that, but you'll never have that Edo period audience again, I don't think so. I mean, maybe you will, but you don't have it now, I would say. And part of it is what this gentleman was asking. I mean, there is an effort to get more people to attend the traditional performing arts. And so if that's your big effort, just, you know, Kabuki isn't going to die anymore, and you know, these arts are going to be around, but if you want to make more, you know, support them less by subsidy and have them be more vibrant, then you do have to try to get new audience members. So it doesn't mean that people who love Kabuki don't go often, but I don't think the actors can ever assume that kind of atmosphere.
I think we'll take one more question. You had a question on that.
Yeah, just a quick question. Thank you very much. I was just wondering about things like Super Kabuki and Super Kabuki 2, and how you would kind of place those new kind of stories in media, like in relation to the historical overview that you were.
Well, I think that they're really important in the sense that, you know, if you look at Kabuki history during the Edo period, it was changing all the time. And the danger is that we don't change it and we kind of lock it up as one thing. So any kinds of new attempts are really important. That's what will keep the art alive, really. So, I mean, that's, you know, just historically, we can be sure that if there aren't new things going on, it's kind of a death knell. But, you know, then personally, so you might like it, you might not, but those kinds of productions I think are really important to the life of the art.
Okay, I think we're going to have to stop there. Thank you very much,
Thank
Catherine.
you.